All right. I'm going to start with the introduction because Swami Prabhupada kind of tells you what he's doing in this and why he's doing it. So we'll start right there with the Eternal Companion about Swami Brahmananda Maharaj. To write the biography of an illumined soul is very difficult, if not impossible, for his is preeminently an inner life. True, he may engage in certain external activities. He may achieve the kind of success which impresses the outer world, but all these activities and achievements, including even his spoken and written teachings, will fall far short of and fail to express the real man. An ordinary professor or scholar teaches out of his accumulated learning. Such a man's scholarship is far greater than the man himself. That is to say, he may teach the loftiest truths, theoretically, without having made them a part of his own life and experience. A man of spiritual wisdom also teaches these truths, not theoretical, but out of his own experience. Nevertheless, the expression of these truths in words cannot possibly correspond to the vastness of his inner knowledge, which is inexpressible because it is transcendental. We know a man with our mind and senses, but our mind and senses cannot reveal to us the nature of an illumined soul. In order to be able fully to understand such a soul, a man must himself be illumined. When you go into the presence of one of these great beings, something very wonderful happens. His mere presence gives you, as it were, a super sense, which enables you to recognize the greatness which is in him. Maharaj, as Swami Brahmananda was called, used to give us that super sense whenever we were with him. Our minds were lifted up and caught glimpses of his inner nature, but these glimpses were only partial. We were aware that the other disciples of Ramakrishna, who were themselves illumined souls, could see more in Maharaj than we, his disciples, ever saw. Swami Ramakrishna Order, founder and head of the Ramakrishna Monastery in Madras, now Mumbai, once introduced Maharaj to his disciples, saying, "None of you have seen Ramakrishna himself, but now you see Maharaj, and that is the same thing." On another occasion, a devotee brought fruit which he wanted to offer to Sri Ramakrishna in the shrine. Swami Ramakrishna Order told him to offer it to Maharaj and said, "To offer this fruit to Maharaj is as good as offering it to Sri Ramakrishna." One day, I hesitated to accept something that Maharaj told me. Swami Shivananda was present at the time, and he agreed with Maharaj immediately. I did not like this. This is Swami Prabhupada talking. Later, I talked to Swami Shivananda alone and more or less accused him of being a yes man to Maharaj. Swami Shivananda laughed and said, "My boy, you see in Maharaj only Maharaj. But we see the external form of Maharaj with nothing inside it but God. Whatever Maharaj tells you comes directly from God." It should be remembered that this statement was not made by a mere ignorant enthusiast, but by one who was himself an illumined soul. Its truth was not clear to me at the time, but later I began to understand and believe it because of a talk which I had with Maharaj himself. One day he asked me to look at the almanac and find an auspicious date for his departure from Madras. As I did so, I could not help smiling. Maharaj noticed this and asked me why I was amused. I replied, Well, Maharaj, you always go through this routine whenever you plan to go anywhere, but then you suddenly make up your mind and leave on some other day. At this, Maharaj said, do you think I do anything according to my own will? The devotees insist upon fixing some date for my going, so to avoid constant pestering, I fix a tentative date. But I do not move or do anything until I know the will of the Lord. Do you mean to say, I asked, that you are always guided by the will of God? Maharaj, yes. Myself, well, Maharaj, I too may think or feel that I'm doing the will of God, but actually I'm only following my own inclinations and attributing them to God's will. Isn't that what you do? Maharaj, no, my child, it is not the same. Myself, then do you mean to say that you actually see God and talk to him directly and know his will? Maharaj, yes, I wait until I know his will directly, and he tells me what I should do. Myself, for everything you do? Maharaj, yes, for everything I do. I have the direct guidance of God. Myself, and do you accept only those disciples he wants you to accept? Maharaj, yes. After this talk with him, I began to find some meaning in his peculiar way of acting. For example, when any of us would ask his advice, he would say, wait, my brain is not working today. Or, my stomach is upset, I'll answer tomorrow. Sometimes many tomorrows would pass before the disciple got any definite answer. But when Maharaj did finally speak, there was always a special power behind his words. How does he know the will of God? Does he go into samadhi every time before he knows it? This was the thought that continually crossed my mind. But not daring to ask him, I waited, hoping somehow to get an answer. Then one day I was discussing with another disciple the spiritual visions of Gopal's mother, a woman disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. She had been given this name because she used to see Gopal, the boy Krishna, playing with her, walking beside her, calling her mother. Many other of her visions were recorded by Swami Sardananda in his Life of Sri Ramakrishna. I expressed my opinion that these visions of Gopal's mother belonged to the transcendental plane, and that I did not believe she had actually seen Sri Krishna with her bodily eyes. Maharaj, who was sitting in his room, overheard me. He came out and said rather sarcastically, "Ah, so you have become omniscient?" But Maharaj, I asked, how can one see God in the external world with bodily eyes? Maharaj then explained that a man who has attained samadhi and reached the transcendental plane receives divine light. He can then see God with closed eyes in the superconsciousness of samadhi, and also with open eyes while fully conscious of the external world. He added that to an enlightened man, there is no longer any line of division between matter and spirit. What you see as matter is really Brahman. In the Upanishads, we read that a knower of Brahman becomes Brahman. What is it that attracts people to a man of God? Young and old, boys and girls, men, women, and children, saints and sinners, all felt an indefinable attraction to Maharaj, even if they did not in the least understand what is meant by a knower of Brahman. When I first met Maharaj, I was a boy of 18. I did not know anything about God or the realization of God. Yet I felt drawn to him as a long-lost friend who was very near and dear to me. I had never felt such a love before in my life. It was the love of parents and the love of a friend, all in one. Everyone had the same experience. Once I asked Swami Subodhananda, another disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, the reason for this all-satisfying love which emanated from Maharaj. The Swami replied, God is love. Maharaj has realized God. Therefore, he is full of love. You did not have to be pure-hearted or spiritually minded to love Maharaj. Even the most depraved natures felt his love when they came into his presence, and many of them were transformed into saints. Maharaj did not talk to everybody about God or spiritual matters or philosophical truths. He would come down, as it were, to the level of each individual. He became that person. He had the power to uplift a man without his even knowing it. And when that person left his presence, he was bathed in love and purity. When you were in the presence of Maharaj, you completely forgot yourself. You felt you were in another world where there was no worry or grief, and where man was not man, but divine. You were filled with a peculiar joy which you could not explain nor understand. Maharaj's bearing was stately and regal. He was tall and well built, and his face was serene and joyful. His eyes were deep, and he always seemed to be gazing into the infinite. Whenever he looked at you, you felt that he was probing the depths of your innermost nature, and that he knew all your weaknesses and failings. But somehow you did not mind this being known through and through, because those eyes were so full of mercy and love. We never feared to be known by him. Then there were the other times when, though his eyes were wide open, it seemed as if the universe no longer existed for him. He seemed to be living in a different world altogether. His hands and feet were beautifully formed, and they possessed a peculiar attraction. His back strikingly resembled the back of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Turiyananda once told me how many years after the passing of Sri Ramakrishna, he saw Maharaj from behind walking in the grounds of Bellard Monastery and mistook him for Sri Ramakrishna himself. Once, in a crowded railway station, I overheard a man who had been observing Maharaj exclaim to a friend, "Look at that man. What part of India does he come from? He isn't a Madrasi or a Parsi or a Bengali or a Punjabi. Can you guess his nationality?" The other answered, "No, I can't. But you can see very well that he is a man of God." Now, when Swami Prabhavananda went back to India for I think he only went back twice after he came to the United States. It may have been 3 times. But all of the monks there took one look at him and said, "Guru Bhakta." Maharaj was equally important as Ramakrishna and Holy Mother to Swami Prabhavananda. Now we'll go into Maharaj's childhood and life with the Master. Swami Brahmananda was born on January 21st in 1863 in Sikra, a village near Calcutta, Bengal. His parents were Ananda Mohan Ghosh and Kailash Kamini. Kailash Kamini, his mother, was devoted to Krishna, and she spent most of her time in prayer, worship, and meditation. Maharaj was her only son. Being a devotee of Krishna, she named him Rakal, the shepherd boy. She passed away when Rakal was 5 years old. Rakal liked being with other children and played all kinds of games with them. He was especially fond of playing church. He would mold a clay image of Divine Mother and worship her with his playmates. During religious festivals, he would take a seat behind the priest. And sometimes, while watching the worship, he would be filled with a fervor of devotion and become absorbed in the thought of Divine Mother. Ananda Mohan loved gardening. As a child, Rakal would work with his father and learned gardening from him at an early age. He was also fond of fishing and would sit patiently with his fishing rod for hours by the pond. Even in later life, we saw that he had never lost these two early enthusiasms of childhood, gardening and fishing. From boyhood, he was a lover of music. He learned songs about Divine Mother and Krishna. He and his friends would go into a mango grove and sing these songs together in chorus. In later years, he encouraged his disciples to sing devotional songs, and he would always keep in his company a few who were expert musicians. Wherever he went, praises of the Lord would be sung. When Rakhal had finished his studies at the village primary school, he went to Calcutta to begin grammar school. He was then 12 years old. Attached to this school was an athletic club, which interested Rakhal very much. The members of the club were young boys, and Narayan, later known as Vivekananda, was their leader. This was how Rakhal and Narayan met. They were of the same age and became very fond of each other. Later, both boys became pupils at a gymnasium directed by a Mr. Guha. At this period, Keshab Chandra Sen was exercising a great influence over the youth of Bengal by his powerful oratory, his fervent devotion, and his vast knowledge of Eastern and Western religions. He was the leader of the Brahmo Samaj. He preached the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. In his talks, he would quote the Upanishads and the Christian Bible. His new line of approach revived an interest in religion amongst the educated classes of Bengal. The creed of the Brahmo Samaj was that theistic conception of the Godhead, which is the only creed of Christianity, and which is also to be found among many other conceptions in the Hindu scriptures. Keshab denounced as polytheism the Hindu cult of many gods and goddesses, although these are in reality merely aspects of the one Brahman. He was opposed to the worship of images in the temples. Narayan and Rakhal joined the movement and subscribed to its creed. Rakhal used to spend most of his time in prayer and contemplation, neglecting his studies. God is our Father, our very own. How shall I reach him? This was the only thought that occupied his mind. Sri Ramakrishna later used to say of him, Rakhal was born with an intense love for God. Such a love is usually acquired only after a man has practiced spiritual disciplines for many years or many lives. Rakhal regularly attended the services of the Brahmo Samaj. His prayer that God might be revealed to him continued incessantly, like the act of breathing. Rakhal was not doing very well at school, so that by the time he reached his 16th birthday, his father was worried about the boy's future. He attributed the neglect of his studies to the emotionalism of adolescence, which had turned his son's mind towards God. If Rakhal were married, the father thought to himself, his mind would be brought down to earth. He would have to consider taking up a career and providing for his wife, and therefore he would study harder. So he arranged for Rakhal's marriage to a young girl named Vishweshwari. Keshab Chandra Sen was the first to preach publicly the greatness of Ramakrishna. Devotees began to flock to the temple of Dakshineshwar to visit the master. Among them were Manamohan Mitra and Shama Sundari, the brother and mother of Vishweshwari. That is a name that gets me every time. At the time of Rakhal's marriage, these two were already ardent devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, whom they regarded as an incarnation of Sri Chaitanya. Thus it came about that the worldly influence of marriage combined with the spiritual influence of Keshav, brought Rakal to the feet of his beloved master. It was natural that Manamohan should introduce Rakal, his new brother-in-law, to Sri Ramakrishna. For some time before their visit, the master had spiritual visions concerning his future disciple. Once, Sri Ramakrishna prayed to Divine Mother, "Mother, I want someone to be my constant companion. Bring me a boy who is pure-hearted and intensely devoted to you." A few days later, he saw in mystic vision a boy standing under the banyan tree in the temple grounds. On another occasion, this same boy appeared to him in a different manner. To quote the master's own words, "A few days before Rakal came to me, Mother placed a little boy on my lap and said, 'This is your son.' At first I was startled. 'My son!' Mother smiled at this and made me understand that I was not to have a son in the ordinary sense, but that this boy would be my spiritual son, one who would live up to the highest ideal of renunciation." From this hour onwards, Sri Ramakrishna waited eagerly for the coming of his spiritual son. A few moments before Rakal actually arrived, he had another vision. Suddenly, he saw a 1,000-petaled lotus blooming on the bosom of the Ganges, each of its petals shining with exquisite loveliness. On the lotus, 2 boys were dancing with anklets on their feet. One of them was Sri Krishna himself. The other was the same boy he had seen in his earlier vision. Their dance was indescribably beautiful. Every movement they made seemed to splash foam, as it were, from an ocean of sweetness. Sri Ramakrishna was lost in ecstasy. Just then, a boat arrived carrying Manamohan and Rakal. Sri Ramakrishna looked at Rakal in bewilderment. "What is this?" he thought to himself. "Here is the boy I saw standing under the banyan tree. Here is the boy Mother placed on my lap. Here is the boy I saw just now dancing on the lotus with Sri Krishna. This is the pure-hearted companion I prayed for to Mother." Sri Ramakrishna regarded Rakal for a few moments in silence. Then he smilingly remarked to Manamohan, "There are wonderful possibilities in this boy." After this, the master talked to Rakal for some time, as though he were an old friend. "What is your name?" he asked. Rakal answered, "Rakal Chandra Ghosh." Hearing the name Rakal, Sri Ramakrishna was deeply excited and muttered to himself, "Rakal, the shepherd boy of Vrindavan, the playmate of Sri Krishna." Then in a sweet, affectionate voice, he said, "Come and see me again." In the presence of the master, Rakal had experienced a peculiar feeling of joy, love, and intense attraction. As he left the temple grounds, that voice, in all its sweetness, kept echoing within his heart, "Come and see me again." He knew that at last he had met a man who had seen and known God. Rakal went back to his home and to school, but he could not forget his visit to the master. Sri Ramakrishna filled all his thoughts, and he was impatient to see him again. A few days later, after school hours, he went alone to Dakshineshwar. The master welcomed him eagerly and said with great affection, "Why didn't you come back to me sooner? I have been waiting for you." Rakal did not know the answer. He looked at the master and felt the same ecstatic joy. He felt like a little child sitting at the feet of God, the Father of all. From that day onward, the relationship between these two was established. Rakal saw in Ramakrishna Father, Mother, and God. Sri Ramakrishna saw in Rakal the divine child. Rakal's visits to the master became more and more frequent. Sometimes he lived at the temple for days. While he was there, his mind entirely forgot the everyday world and became absorbed in the consciousness of God and his presence. He felt himself to be the eternal companion of his divine master. Recalling these early days with Rakal, Sri Ramakrishna used to tell his intimate disciples, "No words can describe Rakal's spiritual mood at that time. He was living in a trance, as it were. He was like a little child, helpless in its mother's arms, and surrendering itself completely to her, always conscious of the divine relationship. And when he was near me, I also was transported into a higher spiritual consciousness. I used to play with him just as Jashoda, the Divine Mother, played with her divine child Krishna." Rakal's father tried in many ways to bring his son's mind back to the interests of worldly life. He gave him strict orders not to go to the temple at Dakshineshwar. When his advice and threats proved to no avail, he had Rakal locked in the house. Rakal longed to go see his master, and Sri Ramakrishna prayed earnestly to the Divine Mother that all obstacles in Rakal's spiritual path might be removed. One day, Ananda Mohan made Rakal sit beside him in his study while he looked over some legal documents. As soon as Rakal noticed that his father was deeply absorbed in the work, he seized the opportunity to slip out of the room and hurried off to his master. Ananda Mohan knew that Rakal must have gone to Sri Ramakrishna, but for some days he could do nothing because he had to attend to a lawsuit in the courts. As soon as he had time, however, he went to Dakshineshwar intending to take his son home. When Rakal saw his father coming, he was frightened and wanted to hide, but Sri Ramakrishna would not let him. So Rakal, following his master's advice, went to meet his father and greeted him with unusual affection and reverence. It was then that Ananda Mohan had a change of heart. Instead of insisting on Rakal's returning home, he simply requested Sri Ramakrishna to send the boy occasionally to see him. So Rakal began living with the master at Dakshineshwar. One day his young wife came to the temple with her mother. Looking at her, Sri Ramakrishna said, "She is born with a divine nature. She will never be an obstacle to Rakal's spiritual progress." The master then sent word to Holy Mother, wife of Sri Ramakrishna, who was also living at the temple, that she should bless the young girl and welcome her as a daughter-in-law. After receiving the blessings, the mother and daughter returned home. Rakal, with a carefree mind, devoted himself to a contemplative life and the service of his beloved Guru. One day, Rakal told Ramakrishna that he felt very hungry and there was no food in the place. As Sri Ramakrishna became greatly concerned, leaving his room, he went to the bank of the Ganges and shouted, "Oh, Gurdasi, come soon. My Rakal is hungry." Shortly after this, Gurdasi, a woman disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, arrived by boat with a few other disciples, bringing food. Sri Ramakrishna was as happy as a child and called Rakal, saying, "Here's food. Now go and eat. You are very hungry." Rakal felt embarrassed and said in a low voice, "Yes, I am hungry, but do you have to advertise it?" Sri Ramakrishna innocently replied, "If you are hungry, what is wrong in saying so? Go and eat now." And I think we'll stop there and we'll go into, he starts to serve Sri Ramakrishna. And I think you're noticing that his relationship with Sri Ramakrishna does not have the usual formality that so many of the relationships do. There's quite an intimate relationship where they don't have any, "Why did you tell them I'm hungry?" What are you doing? You're embarrassing me. And he has no shy about telling him. And Ramakrishna has the same kind of feeling about rock hall. Are there any questions or comments?
I think you might have a slightly different edition to the one that I have.
Yeah, me too.
This one.
I have the first edition.
Yes, because there were a few places where it was just slightly different.
Oh, okay, I'll get a hold of your edition, but this was the
Did
first.
everybody else agree with that?
Yeah.
I'm sure you do, because this one is the 1947 edition.
Yes, I noticed that as well.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, yeah.
I have the Kindle edition, and it was different in some places, just a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll go over to the bookstore and get the edition that you have, although I love this one. This is the one that I read all the time.
I have that one somewhere, but I can't find it.
I know.
I'm keeping this one because Brahmananda signed this one, so I don't care what you say.
I know.
This is it was revised in 1960.
Okay, see, and I have,
First edition, 1944. You have the first edition. And mine was slightly different from what you were just.
yeah, well, I have, this one is Barred upon us, because I too, Lavanya, have misplaced mine, which Swami signed. I think it ended up in the corner bookstore at Ojai in when I moved into the convent, which is really irritating to me.
I'm really sorry to hear that.
Me too. But this is the 1947 edition. I didn't realize there were differences between the editions. Are they big differences?
No.
Is this one a little more,
No, it's more, ours are a little more modern in the phrasing.
yeah, okay.
It's a little more concise.
It's essentially the same, but it changes.
This one is a little more, I don't want to say devotional, but a little more Indian, a little bit more Indian. Yeah.
Well, it's just in the translation. Yeah, it's a little.
There is no translation. He wrote this in English.
Well, then I don't know why they would have changed it.
And he revised it. Probably.
Oh, then we have his.
You have revised editions. I have the 47 edition.
He changed his English.
Yes, there is no translation. So, okay, but I'm glad to know that. I didn't realize. I haven't read one of the new ones. So I will look at it and see. And you may have to just put up with me reading this one. Okay.
That's okay. I just wanted to double check.
Yeah.
It was me.
The problem with book revisions. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, then we'll end with a chant. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.